Do you feel like Phil really wanted you for his long-term plan?
I think so. I mean, that was a situation where I actually really sat down and, looked him in the eye, man to man, and he told me that. So that's the only thing that I can go off of. Another man sitting in front of me and telling me, what he feels, what he likes, what's his plan. That's the only thing that I can really go off of. Now, if you go back on that word and, for me to look a man in their eyes and lie to them, then that's a different story.
Well, that was just over a year ago. Clearly, Phil Jackson not in the long-term plans for the Knicks. As for Carmelo, well, that remains to be seen. Hey there, welcome to SI Now. It is Wednesday, June 28th. I am Maggie Gray.
And I am Aaron Nagler, here all week. News breaking overnight that the New York Knicks and team president Phil Jackson have agreed to part ways with 2 years left on Phil's deal.
And $24 million.
Quite a bit of money. The move follows weeks of turmoil as reports surfaced that the team was listening to offers for Latvian phenom and former 4th overall pick Kristaps Porzingis, as well as seemingly never-ending drama surrounding Carmelo Anthony. With Jackson out, let's take a look back at his rocky road in the Knicks front office. Love ending on Spike there.
Yeah, he's a happy man today.
To help us sort through the detritus of the Phil Jackson era, we're joined on the phone by former president of basketball operations for the Minnesota Timberwolves, David Kahn.
And David, we really appreciate you joining us. Of course, you were on our NBA draft show last Thursday night, and you foreshadowed that the fallout from the Porzingis trade rumors could be significant. Now, less than a week later, Phil Jackson out as team president. Are you surprised at the timing?
A little bit, just because free agency starts, in 3 days. On the other hand, maybe that's what really precipitated this, is the fact that free agency starts in a few days. And as I said last week, in fact, I didn't expect to speak to you this soon, Maggie, but as I said to you last week, it was just an odd 48 to 72 hours in the middle of last week. It's one thing to have one, relationship, meaning the Anthony relationship, the Carmelo Anthony relationship, be sort of difficult. But then when you add the Porzingis relationship, which clearly became difficult last week, and as Phil Jackson even alluded to it publicly in an interview, that creates a lot of sort of overhang tension on a franchise. And as I said last week, it bared watching as we move forward.
From your vantage point, from the experience you have over 20 years in basketball, what do you think the future holds for Carmelo Anthony and the Knicks?
I don't know about Carmelo Anthony and the Knicks. I think that Carmelo Anthony is still a very fine basketball player, although he's getting older. He can still score with the best of them. Like many older players, he's become a little bit injury prone the last few years, but there's no question that, he still is somebody who, is a dynamic scorer. The question is now, does he stay in New York because of this change in management? And I think that there's part of him that probably wants to, or does he try to figure out a way to join one of these so-called super teams now in the next, several days? And I think, as has been made public also in the last week with his situation in his marital relationship, he also has to factor in how to be the best father he can be. And that means staying close to his son in all likelihood. And so there are a lot of variables in that situation, including the personal variable.
David, with Phil Jackson now gone, Steve Mills will be in charge of the day-to-day operations. Tim Leiweke will serve as an advisor. But what does this mean for the Knicks in free agency? I mean, this move coming so close to the deadline.
Well, first of all, Steve Mills is a very competent, capable person who's worked in the league office. He's worked for the Players Association. He's worked for teams for a number of years. And I suspect, and this is no shot at Phil, but Steve Mills, in effect, has been running the Knicks on a day-to-day basis as, in effect, the COO or the general manager. And so I don't think that there will be much that will change in terms of, how the Knicks operate. But I think from a philosophical standpoint, now that Phil is gone, I think that there may be some release in terms of the types of players that they're looking for in free agency and the style of play. And by the way, in Tim Leiweke's case, Tim is deeply involved with Irving Azoff. They have a company now that is involved with either rehabbing or building new arenas and working out deals with existing arenas on sponsorship. Irving Azoff is the person who introduced Jim Dolan to Phil Jackson 3 years ago. And so when you say that, Tim Leiweke is going to be an advisor, my suspicion is that he's already been somewhat advising the Knicks through his relationship with Irving Azoff. And so, again, I don't think that that's a big change either. I think that what you'll see is Steve Mills running the team as he's been running it, so to speak. He just doesn't have somebody above him to bounce ideas off of or to take direction from.
Right. Do you think players would be more likely to sign in New York now that they, won't have to be forced to be playing in a triangle offense that seems to have run its course in the league?
Well, I think that had to be part of what was weighing on, ownership in the franchise. New York should be a place that players gravitate towards. It's New York, after all. It's arguably the world's capital, not just, United States, center. And also Madison Square Garden has a history that is, perhaps unmatched in the league. And certainly over the last couple of years, there was, the kind of insinuation and innuendos that it was becoming a more difficult place to play, perhaps because of the turmoil and because of the changeover, and also because of this philosophical issue with the offense. It's kind of strange, the offense. It's the only team that sort of has its offense emblematic of itself, and I think that was a mistake right from the beginning. In other words, it's not whether you play the triangle or not. It's why do you have to talk about it so much? Why do you have to make it a sort of a lead item on your agenda? And I think that, perhaps in retrospect, it's now dawning on everybody that that wasn't the best recruiting tool. It just wasn't something that they needed to speak about. I think players will continue to want to play in New York, but there will also be caution this week and next as to what happens next. This is very fresh, and I think that usually, in the aftermath of something like this occurring, there tends to be a lot of sort of hands waving in the air and, tumult. I think as things settle down, we'll see in terms of how the franchise is viewed by the players.
Yeah, and interesting what they're going to do in free agency and what kind of moves they even have to make in free agency, David. And, this kind of ties into our next question, which goes away from the Knicks for a moment, but to the Houston Rockets, who have reportedly emerged as a serious contender for Chris Paul, who has opted out of his contract with the Los Angeles Clippers. Now, we're hearing a lot of things from the Rockets, that they might want Chris Paul, that they want to be in on the Paul George sweepstakes. But how could they potentially pull this off? And in your opinion, is it smart for them to go after someone like Chris Paul when they already have James Harden as their primary ball handler?
Well, let me address both. Let's stick with the Knicks for just one more second.
Yeah.
Carmelo Anthony's situation does have to be resolved, but it probably doesn't exist or occur in the form of cap relief. In other words, whether it's a trade, then there's salary coming back. If it's a release or a waiver, then the salary stays on the books for the Knicks, and there's probably not much cap relief that can be had, and they're sort of stuck in that respect. As for the Rockets, I've been puzzled. I don't have any special insight in the sense of, having talked to anybody, but it just seems odd that James Harden, having made such a successful transition under Mike D'Antoni to being the lead, ball handler, I won't call him a point guard because he's not a conventional point guard, but there's no question that he's the lead ball handler and he dominates the ball to great success in Houston. And then to add another person such as Chris Paul, who also is a very ball-dominant player, this whole thing has seemed odd to me. Again, I'll confess, I don't have any special knowledge in having spoken to anybody about it, but it just seems a strange pairing in that Harden just succeeded to levels that nobody ever quite envisioned last year, precisely because he had the ball in his hand so much. And you would think that that would be limited somewhat with a player like Chris Paul.
Absolutely. And just because you've been part of these negotiations, you've done so many of these deals, read between the lines for us a little bit. Who do you think may be pushing the Chris Paul to Houston rumors? Like, where could they be coming from?
It could be coming from Chris Paul and his people, perhaps. It could be coming from the Rockets for strategic purposes. You just never know. It always makes you uneasy. As much as you think you might know, the more that you have to, read on the internet or listen to hearsay about what may be happening, it creates this feeling of discomfort. And unfortunately, that discomfort travels throughout the entire organization. If you can think of just the simplest thing as a ticket seller, and he's dealing with his client, one of his season ticket accounts, and he's getting an email this morning. Hey, what's going on? Is he coming? I mean, is he staying? Is he leaving? The customers want to know. They're affected by this, the ticket buyers. And you can understand then throughout the entire franchise that kind of uneasiness this week and next as this all plays out until something finally happens for certain, as opposed to just being, anonymously sourced in somebody's column.
Very interesting. David Kahn, really appreciate your insight. Spent over 20 years in the NBA with the Indiana Pacers and their front office, also, of course, with the Timberwolves. David, you and I met a little over a week ago. I've now spoken to you more than most members of my own family in that last week. So appreciate your insight and really appreciate your expertise.
Well, thank you, Maggie. Like I said, I didn't expect to see you or talk to you. So I've not seen you, of course, but I didn't expect to talk to you so soon. But an interesting morning, that's for sure.
Absolutely. Appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks, David.
Some good insight there from, obviously, a former general manager. But let's talk a little bit about Phil Jackson. Let's go back to that for a moment. We'll put Chris Paul aside.
And let's wait. Before we do that, guys, I see you on Facebook.
Yeah,
you're all chiming in. Hit us up, please. Give us your thoughts. A couple people wishing Phil would go back to Montana and never be heard from again. A couple people saying the Knicks didn't deserve Phil Jackson. So it's nice to see a split, a dichotomy.
So let's talk about that balance,
Some hating on Phil,
right?
some hating on the Knicks.
And you saw it when we played the timeline of sort of Phil's tenure as the president here in New York. Started with fans cheering and now ending with fans cheering with him being shown the door. With the 11 rings that he had as a player and as a coach, now this is a failure in New York. I mean, his record is terrible, and he didn't do anything to significantly help the team. In fact, he hurt the team by being the president. So what does this do to his legacy? Is it take the shine off of what is a Hall of Famer and a legendary coach?
I think in the long term, it won't, but in the short term, in the foreseeable future, especially in this day and age of social media, it absolutely will. I think that's all anyone will talk about. To me, you know me, I'm a football guy, so I bring everything back to the NFL. But to me, this is a perfect parallel with Mike Holmgren's career. A coach who rose the ranks and became an amazing, championship caliber, championship winning head coach who wanted more power, wanted to do personnel, got it, went to Cleveland of all places and just absolutely flamed out and, became kind of a laughingstock. Phil Jackson has followed that model. And as much as it kind of probably hurts to say it, like I said, the short term, he's going to be viewed as a failure because, you can't call his time in New York anything other than that.
It makes, I think, people go back and really look at the totality of Phil Jackson's coaching record.
Right.
And listen, there were people out there, and this is not to take anything away from Phil, because far be it for me to do that. Right. But there are people who look at his coaching tenure and say, yes, he did win, but look at the talent he had. And was Phil's success more about managing egos, making things fit, making the chemistry of the team the best it could possibly be and getting the best out of them, as opposed to being the guru, the master, the X's and O's mastermind. But here's the thing. Kobe Bryant loved the triangle.
Yes.
Michael Jordan. There were a lot of teams that were successful and players that were successful.
That's what I would point to is the fact that, I understand that criticism, but when you look at, especially the work he did after Shaq left the Lakers, I just look at the guys who played for him and how they just revere him. And whether it's Steve Kerr, whether it's Michael Jordan, whoever, he did the work as far as the rotation and knowing when to push the right buttons. That's all part of coaching, and he did it better than anybody. So Yes, did he have supreme talent to work with? Of course he did. But most people who've won multiple championships have had a bunch of talent at their disposal. I just think, when you look at his coaching tenure, either in LA or Chicago, you just can't take that away from him.
One thing I think that's interesting, and I'm not the first person to bring this up, others have, but I think it's worth mentioning again, which is in this role for Phil Jackson, this was not a hands-on, every day you're around the team and around the players. In fact, it's the opposite.
As David
a general
just said.
manager really needs to be almost a bit removed from the players. If you'll read Michael Lewis's book where he talks to Daryl Morey, he said, well, why not just have someone who's on a completely different coast, a completely different office, someone who's never attached to the players, who could have sort of that omniscient, sort of eye, if you will, and not be swayed by any personal connections. Phil, I think his best work was when he was doing the day-to-day with the players.
When
he was passing out books to them and having them read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance
well, that's
or whatever.
The thing. You're connecting to your team. You're imparting a message. You're setting a plan. I don't think he had to do any of that here in New York. So maybe, I don't want to call it complacency, but there's a lack of having your finger on the pulse, so to speak.
Or it's just playing to your strengths.
Well,
I don't think that being in that position as president played to the strengths of Phil Jackson.
Okay, and I want to touch on something Andrew here just said on Facebook. Part of it is it's the Knicks, and it's still Dolan. And there's all this baggage with this franchise.
I get that, but Dolan was very true to his word that he was not going to meddle like he did with Donnie Walsh and other presidents who were running the Knicks at the time. And the Knicks were a playoff team before Phil Jackson got there.
I think that's true, especially down the stretch here. I mean, he picked up his 2 years in this past April. I think at the start of the tenure, though, you still heard lots of reports of Dolan meddling and kind of suggesting things and trying to maneuver things in the front office. I think he's finally got hands off as things went on. It's still Dolan, though, to me.
Yes, Dolan does not deserve a lot of credit here.
No.
I mean, things were going south so long ago with Phil Jackson. The Porzingis trade helped him a little bit because it showed, obviously, I mean, the one person at the Knicks who deserves a raise is the European scout. But it showed that, perhaps he does have an eye for talent. But that didn't bear out. I mean, he was not able to put together a team that was a legitimate playoff team at all. And, oh, by the way, also ticked off his star player who he gave a no-trade clause to and the up-and-coming face of the team in Porzingis. Everything about this was a fail, but I'm not ready to give James Dolan credit now for cutting ties.
Well, that's what he's gonna bask in for now. There's the fact that New York Knicks fans are happy that this guy is gone. But it's really just deodorant over what really stinks about this franchise, which is Dolan's ownership and his stewardship of the franchise. I don't think anyone could dispute that. It is interesting, though, how with Jackson and everything you're mentioning, I would be very interested to hear Melo's thoughts today, just because of that bite we played at the top of the show, where he's talking about looking him in the eye, man to man, et cetera, and saying how he was supposedly in the long-term plans, flying against and in the face of all reporting that says that Jackson had basically told Dolan that he should be elsewhere, that his time with the franchise should be up.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the few times that Jackson even spoke to the media, was to basically say Carmelo should leave and Porzingis is on the trade block, which was just not smart by any stretch. It's interesting, going back to that interview that I did with Melo that day, I remember almost feeling bad that I asked that question afterwards, because Melo is pretty gracious in his interviews, and he bristled at that one, and I thought, geez, did I cross the line there, And now, well, it looks pretty prescient.
You were prescient.
I know, gosh. Aaron, turning to tennis. Wimbledon starts this week. I sat down with James Blake on Tuesday. He weighed in on the John McEnroe, Serena Williams drama and Novak Djokovic's struggles and a whole lot more. Meanwhile, keep commenting on Facebook. We'll watch. My next guest has been ranked as high as number 4 in the world of men's tennis. He was the top-ranked American. He is an activist, a New York Times best-selling author who has a new book called Ways of Grace. James Blake is here. Really great to see you, and thank you so much for being here. Got a lot of area to cover with you, and actually all kind of tangentially goes back to this book. And one is your case against the NYPD that was settled recently. Obviously, you were mistaken for someone who you were not. A police officer used excessive force on you. If you can take yourself back to that day, September of 2015, what kind of emotions come up even now?
Well, even now, I still think about a lot of different ways. I think I'm really lucky. I think I'm lucky that I didn't react any differently. I think about that actually often, that I'm glad none of my friends were around, because the officer never said that he was an officer, never said NYPD. So I have a feeling my friends would have taken this as a pretty hostile act and taken action. And with other officers on the scene, that could have been very, very tragic. And it was really unfortunate. And I from the first day, I didn't plan on getting any financial gain out of it. I didn't want to make the taxpayers pay for anything that I went through. I wanted to do something good for those that didn't have a voice, that didn't have the recourse I had, that couldn't go to the press, that couldn't go to a lawyer and an agent and someone to help them. So it became pretty crystal clear once I talked to my wife, and she said, what if this had happened to me? And made me realize I didn't want this to happen to other people, which is the reason we came to the settlement we did with the city, to get a fellowship to help fight these cases. Over 50% of them last year didn't get seen through to completion. So we want to make sure those get seen through to completion, and there's some accountability.
Obviously, in sports, we've seen this in other areas. Colin Kaepernick, one of the missions that he is championing is trying to improve the relationship between minorities and law enforcement, fighting injustices that he sees are occurring there. As of now, not signed by an NFL team.
Yeah.
If he is not signed by the time the season starts, what would that indicate to you?
Well, we talk about that in the book, is that he knows what he was doing when he took a stand. When he spoke to Dr. Harry Edwards, he knows the rights inside and out. He knows the position that he wanted to take, and he's fighting, in my opinion, a pretty noble cause, because there have been rifts between African Americans and the police, and I just think my case in particular was, you want to say, a bad apple or a few bad apples. I really think most of the police do a great job, and they're heroic in their efforts, but I think there needs to be accountability for the ones that are doing the job the wrong way, because they erode the trust. I think Colin Kaepernick's position is important, and I think his stance is going to lead to many other conversations. The fact that he's not signed, it's tough for me to see in the NFL, because they've had a history of allowing others, when they have misdeeds taking place off the field, they're still welcomed back. Sometimes with open arms, sometimes with a little bit of protest. But then if you produce on the field, you're right back into welcomed into the fans' arms, and I don't think that's really fair.
You also write about gender bias in your book, and this is just happening in the news right now, where John McEnroe made some comments about Serena Williams, saying, yes, he believes she is the best female tennis player of all time, but when asked if she's just the best tennis player, if you take female out of it, he said if she played on the men's circuit, she would be ranked somewhere in the 700s. Do you interpret that as being misogynist and sexist, or is that just John McEnroe's opinion?
I think that's John McEnroe's opinion. I think John McEnroe speaks his mind often, and he's entitled to that. And I think the discussion around Serena Williams shouldn't be whether she's the best female tennis player or the best tennis player. It's bordering on whether she should be the best athlete of all time. And I think you put her up in the consideration in the conversation with Michael Jordan, with Muhammad Ali, with Babe Ruth, with people like that. And I just don't know why there ever needs to be qualifiers after that. I feel like she's transcended at each step she's taken. She's transcended being the first African-American female to do something, the first African-American to do anything, the first female. She's an incredible athlete. I think that's all that needs to be said. And maybe I'm biased. I think she's a great person too. But she's someone that deserves so much adoration, and she's looked up to by so many in our sport, and she's opened so many doors for a lot of others. So I just don't think there needs to be qualifiers with Serena Williams anymore.
You look at the men's side. Federer's back after taking off the clay court season. Obviously, Nadal coming off his French Open win. If you were to bet, I guess, on who would be more likely to make it to the final, Federer or Nadal in Wimbledon, who would you take?
I would take Fed right now. I just think his game on grass, he won one of the grass court tune-ups. He's played so well. It's amazing to me that in 2017 we're talking about Fed and Nadal being the two of the favorites here, because their longevity is just incredible. They're two of the greats of all time, and I'm just amazed that we're still getting to see them, and happy. As a tennis fan, I'm happy I get to see two of the best of all time competing at their best still this far into their careers, and I think Roger has a great chance to win another Wimbledon this year.
Assess where Novak Djokovic is right now.
not at that same level of Roger and Rafa right now. It doesn't seem. I think his head is spinning a little bit. He's fired his whole team. He's starting up new, maybe with Andre Agassi, and that's sort of a trial basis. And I just think he's searching a little bit. I don't think it's physical at all. I think he's going to get back to it, but it's just going to take kind of maybe a clearing of the head. And it's been tough for him to focus just on tennis. And I think his head is off the court right now.
What do you expect from him in this tournament?
In this tournament, I think it's going to be too early for him to turn that around and get it right back. But I wouldn't be surprised if by the end of this year, he's back to being the Novak Djokovic that we're used to seeing, the one that's competing for every point and making it so difficult for anyone to hit winners on him. And, back to being in consideration for the best player in the world.
James Blake, congratulations. Ways of Grace, your second book. You're already a New York Times bestseller, as I said, activist, athlete, ally, and so many things. Really appreciate your perspective. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
You know who's got to be loving the Phil Jackson news today?
Who's that?
The New York Mets. Because they're not going to be front page news anymore. Meanwhile,
man.
Mets ace Noah Syndergaard still dealing with an injured lat muscle that has had him sidelined since late April. But while he may not be able to pitch on the field, Aaron Nagler, that isn't stopping him from pitching some product. Syndergaard stopped by yesterday to talk about Cholula hot sauce and a lot more. Last time you pitched was April 20th. It's been a while. Of course, the Mets under 500. Has this been the most frustrating period for you personally as a professional?
Yes and no. Just because you're dying to be out there as a competitor and an athlete. But I do know, I'm injured now, but there's some other things I can work on. Hip flexibility and just being more athletic, as opposed to sometimes when you see me running out there, Gazelman kind of said it best. I look like a fat guy running with flip-flops.
Any update on you and when you might be able to return? What's the latest?
There's really no timetable right now. Just continue rehab, get healthy, and support the team. Try to be the best team I can possibly be.
Have there been any conversations about shutting it down for the entire season?
No, there have not.
Okay, and that's probably got to be encouraging for you then, right?
Yeah, because I'm itching to get back out there. All I want to do is go out there and compete. Right now, I'm not being able to do so. So it's kind of frustrating,
You probably heard though about Asdrubal Cabrera.
My agent, we told my agent about it. If he didn't have any plan to me, I think it's time to make a move,
Were you surprised that he would even mention that just because the team asked him to switch positions?
I can understand he might have been a little frustrated and whatnot, but I'm focused on my rehab and getting healthy.
Have you thought about Aaron Judge from the Yankees and what type of pitch you would want to try to throw to him to try and strike him out?
I love my fastball. I feel like that's one of my biggest strengths, and I think it kind of exposes a lot of hitters' weaknesses. So, so he can prove that he can my fastball, I'll just continue to do that.
Give him the heater. Speaking of heat, Cholula hot sauce, new special edition flavor and a website to go along with it. Can you tell us about it?
Yes, so the order Cholula. One thing that I'm really, really passionate about is because, growing up in Texas, a big hot sauce guy, but it's Cholula is all about the flavor. There's really no heat to it all. It's got a nice little kick to it, but nothing too overpowering to where it's overcoming the flavor. You have all these guys that going like myself. We have a guy that, he traveled in his van and cooked in his van for 2 years, went on adventures, and he used Cholula to help with his diet. You have a guy that ended up losing 60 pounds, and Cholula was accredited with that because, how much fun is it eating healthy? So I think that's great, and it's just a place for a lot of passionate fans to gather and learn more about unique stories from other Cholula fans.
That's fantastic. You had a whole Cholula community, right, that can follow along with you. Do you get a lifetime supply of this stuff?
I would like to think so. I'm going to have it on tap.
If you had to bet your lifetime supply of Cholula that we think is going to be there, do you think you'll be teammates with Tim Tebow before the season is over?
No. I'm not going to. I wouldn't put that bet.
Not taking that bet?
No.
Not going to see him in September?
No.
What makes you so sure?
It's just a hunch.
Noah Syndergaard, really appreciate your time. Have fun eating and maybe even drinking the Cholula. Why not?
We'll see.
Good good thing, Aaron, that even when the Mets
Yeah.
are bad, their broadcasting team really is one of the best in the majors. Last night, after watching yet another Mets pitcher, Robert Gazelman, go down with an injury, analyst and former pitcher Ron Darling had this to say.
Be trainers and gets them in a room with some of the old trainers and people that took care of baseball players and how to keep them healthy, and get them in a room and try to tap into some of their knowledge on how you train baseball players, not weightlifters, not six-pack wearers, baseball players. They're doing a disservice to their million-dollar athletes that they're paying. It's a joke to watch this happen each and every night.
Darling fed up and blaming it on the trainers and just the approach to how baseball players train. Does Darling have a point here?
I think he does. I mean, look, I think it's a fine line. I mean, you can't ignore science. You can't ignore modern training methods. I think that's silly. But to his overarching point, the idea that some guys, and I think this is in pro athletes in general, the idea that you're not training for the gym, you are training for the field or the court or what have you. I think there's some validity there because, look, these are very specific movements / kind of athletic feats that you're asking these guys to do. They do them day in and day out. But if you are focusing on your six-pack abs, if you are focusing on getting stronger in the weight room as opposed to just functional strength on the baseball diamond, yeah, I think there may be something to it. Now, as someone who knows a couple trainers around Major League Baseball, I have a really good friend on the Brewers staff who, he's a very new age guy who brings in everything new that he can learn and try and stay one step ahead of things. I think, like I said, I think it's kind of silly to totally poo-poo it and throw it out the window as far as, okay, all these new methods are junk. But at the same time, I think Darling has a very good point in that, yeah, you got to target for the game you're playing.
Well, and look at Darling, who calls every single Mets game. I mean, Syndergaard himself, who hasn't pitched since late April, he even put on 20 pounds,
right.
and got bigger and bulked up. And who knows, he could have been injured anyway, but it doesn't seem like that kind of weight gain helped him and
right.
prevented any kind of injuries. Here's one thing I'll bring up, and I am not a trainer, nor do I play one on the internet, but is there also something about the specialization of baseball players today and just how much they are doing these repetitive movements
right.
over and over again from such a young age? And perhaps does that create some more wear and tear that maybe 20 years ago, or when Ron Darling was pitching in the World Series in 1986, that wasn't the way that baseball players were groomed back then?
I think there's maybe something to that. The issue I would take, though, is that it's not league-wide. It's not, you know what I mean? Like, the Mets clearly are snake bit in a way, prompting the New York Daily News to put on their cover, "Why does God hate the Mets?" It got so bad earlier this season. But, I think specialization in general hurts kids when they're coming up. But I can't point to that as a reason that the Mets have had this kind of overflow of injuries.
Yeah.
But I do think that's an issue in kids' sports.
Can I tell a quick story? I was at Mets opening day a couple years ago. I haven't been in a while, but I was there a couple years ago for Sports Illustrated. And, opening day, they really announce every person who's part of the organization comes out, gets an applause. There's still hope. It's opening day. The trainers were booed by the fans that day.
That's so unfortunate. That's so unfortunate.
No, the fans are smart.
No,
and Ron Darling would agree.
In that instance, the fans are dumb. These guys are working their butts off to try and help the players that you've paid money to come see. And I understand injuries are frustrating, but booing the training staff, that's ridiculous.
I don't know about that. Aaron Nagler, it's been a lot of fun today. Thanks a lot. I love it when we get a little breaking news around here with Phil Jackson. And the Knicks have parted ways. We appreciate you guys watching and commenting on Facebook Live. Of course, stick with SI.com for all the latest breaking news as we inch closer and closer to NBA free agency on July 1st. We're going to have a lot of whirlwind of activity, I can only imagine. Boy. And, of course, follow us on Twitter at SI Now Live. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Who knows what Thursday will bring?
Who knows?
We'll be back tomorrow.